Good morning and welcome to Daily 15. It's good to have you back. Today's Daily 15 is titled Williams on Categorical Desires, and it comes from a paper by Bernard Williams titled Persons, Character, and Morality. Williams asks why, if at all, we ought to fear death and what this means for our conception of ourselves. As always, if you'd like to read along, you can head to alifeofthought.com/d15, or if you'd like to join the conversation, head on over to community.alifeofthought.com. After all, what I say here is not supposed to be the last word, it's supposed to be the first one. So with that being said, we'll get into today's paragraph. Williams begins. It might be wondered why, unless we believe in a possibly hostile afterlife, or in the muddle which Epicureans claim to expose, we should regard death as an evil. One answer to that is that we desire certain things. If one desires something, then to that extent one has reason to resist the happening of anything which prevents one from getting it. And death certainly does that, for a large range of desires. Some desires are admittedly contingent on the prospect of one's being alive, but not all desires can be in that sense conditional, since it is possible to imagine a person rationally contemplating suicide in the face of some predicted evil, and if he decides to go on in life, that he is propelled forward into it by some desire, however general or inchoate, which cannot operate conditionally on his being alive, since it settles the question of whether he is going to be alive. Such a desire we may call a categorical desire. Most people have many categorical desires which do not depend on the assumption of a person's continued existence, since they serve to prevent that assumption's being questioned, or to answer the question if it is raised. Thus, one's pattern of interests, desires, and projects not only provide the reason for an interest in what happens within the horizon of one's future, but also constitute the conditions of there being such a future at all. So we'll get right into today's paragraph and start with a highlighted phrase. Williams says, "It might be wondered why, unless we believe in a possibly hostile afterlife, or in the muddle which the Epicureans claim to expose, we should regard death as an evil." Now, as we've seen, Williams is a thinker whose writing rewards deep scrutiny, and in order to get the most out of this short excerpt, it will help us to get a sense of what he's trying to do in this paper overall. The paper begins as a critique of moral systems like Kantianism and utilitarianism. This might come as a surprise. Maybe you've heard these before, and you've heard them cast in opposition to each other. I.e., you're either a utilitarian and you care about maximizing pleasure, or you're a Kantian and you care about doing the right thing. But what Williams wants to say is that neither view properly captures the kinds of beings that we are and forces us to, in the name of coming to some moral conclusion, a conclusion about what to do. We're forced to abstract away from our very identities. Now, the specifics here are not as important, but once we recognize that this is what Williams is trying to do, that he's trying to make a point about the nature of our identities, then say that it is a point which these philosophical theories miss, it hopefully will begin to make a little bit more sense why he's discussing categorical desires in the first place. That is to say that it's precisely these kinds of desires, the desires that propel us into the future, that are sort of our core projects, that Williams is going to worry that these moral theories abstract away from. Now, one more bit of background for you. Williams references Epicureans. There is a famous line of thought in philosophy which says that death is not to be feared because there's nothing to experience in it. We will, after all, be dead. According to this way of thinking, people who are afraid of death are simply confused. They think that they'll be experiencing something bad, but in reality, there will be nothing at all, certainly nothing good, but nothing bad either, so there's nothing to fear. And part of what Williams is trying to do here is give an example of some desire of ours, these categorical desires, which explain why death is something that we fear. Namely, these desires are sort of so important to us that they give us a reason to continue living. So a sudden death, for example, would deprive us of the ability to satisfy them, to get whatever it is, perhaps it's justice or equality, that propels us into the future. And in a certain sense, that is a great loss, even though we won't be around to feel it. That brings us to today's underlined phrase. Williams says, which cannot operate conditionally on his being alive, since it settles the question of whether he is going to be alive. Now, of course, the best way to understand the purpose of Williams's discussion of categorical desires is to see the use that he puts them to. His thought seems to be that categorical desires are different from normal desires or other desires, which are quote-unquote contingent on our being alive. It's going to help to work with a specific example. We might imagine a young environmentalist who cares deeply about conservation and protecting wildlife, and another person who wants to see a movie. We should immediately feel that these desires are of two different kinds. The question of suicide helps to draw this out. Namely, the thought goes, if our moviegoer was asking the question of whether or not he should end his own life, or asking the question of whether he had any reason to go on living, the reminder that he has a movie to see would not, at least we would expect, be of any help to him in making this decision. Now, this isn't necessarily true, strictly speaking. He might care very deeply about going to the movie. Perhaps he's been waiting to see this movie his whole life. We can imagine that some hypothetical person who's sort of like this. And this draws out a sense in which it's not necessarily the content or the object of the desire which makes it categorical or conditional for Williams, but our sort of way of relating to it, what it means to us, the role it plays in our lives. But it's at least easier to imagine us being closer to desires that seem to us, us here and now, more important. So turn to our environmentalist. We might imagine that if she began to ask the question of whether she ought to go on, it would be precisely the recognition that there's still work to do, that the environment still needs saving, that would pull her from the brink. It would offer her a reason to go on living. And this, I think, is why Williams calls these desires categorical, in the sense that they're not contingent on our lives. If we no longer want to live, the desire to see a movie, assuming that we don't care that much about the movie, that it's not something we've been waiting to do, working towards our entire lives, rings hollow. But the categorical desire is sort of flipped. It's not that once we're suicidal, the desire to go see the movie goes away. If it's a categorical desire, the desire to help the environment gives us a reason to go on, to keep going. I may be feeling down in the dumps, but the reminder that the environment is still there to be saved takes me out of that space. And, another important point of clarification is that categorical desires need not be so altruistic. They might be other people, and they might even be something about ourselves, learning or the pursuit of knowledge. And insofar as it's another person, it might be a loved one or a very close friend. What is crucial, though, is that they play this flipped role. They do not depend on us. We depend on them. And it's easy to see how this is going to be a response to that point about death. Yes, death may have no experiences. There may be nothing it's like to die, so we're not going to experience anything bad, but we'll also be prevented from pursuing our categorical desires. We'll still have a reason to go on living. Work will be unfinished. And so death, inasmuch as it prevents us from completing that work, is a loss. And this brings us to our circled phrase. Williams says that these categorical desires, these core projects of ours, give us a reason for an interest in what happens within the horizon of one's future, but also constitute the conditions of there being such a future at all. Now, Williams's point here is subtle, but I think important. So far, we've sort of described categorical desires as giving us reasons to care about our future, but Williams might push back on us and say that we're underselling them. These desires don't simply give us reasons to care about the future. as if we sort of exist independently of them and observe them and say, oh, look, there's a reason to care about the future. Rather, they're the very things that allow for us to have a future at all. Our future is conditional on them. This is going to prove important later when we start thinking about how moral questions relate to such categorical desires. Namely, if morality requires me to step back from myself, to think from the perspective of the many rather than from my own point of view, impartially, without any specific person or any specific person's desires figuring into my reasoning, we might worry that it forces us to give up on the very things, or it distances us from the very things that propel us into the future in the first place. There's no need to take a stance on this now. We'll come back to this actually in the next Daily 15, so stay tuned. But Williams's worry is eventually going to be that morality sort of sneaks in as a step in between ourselves and these categorical desires. It says, you can only act on them, pursue them when I say it's okay, when I sign off. But where, he will ask, does it require the strength to do this? If it's precisely our categorical desires and not morality that answer the question for us of why we should go on living. And he's going to say there's a problem if it's sort of built in from the get-go, if morality requires that whenever there's a conflict between morality and these categorical desires of ours, that morality wins. This is going to alienate us or hurt our integrity somehow. It's going to hurt our connection to the very things that propel us into the future. That's all for paragraph 1. We'll take a look at the next one. Now, if you recall, the first paragraph we read ended with these categorical desires constituting the condition of there being such a future at all, a future for us. And Williams continues, here once more, to deal in terms of later selves who are like descendants would be to misplace the heart of the problem. Whether to commit suicide and whether to leave descendants are two separate questions. One can produce children before committing suicide. A person might even choose deliberately to do that for comprehensible sorts of reasons, or again, one could be deterred as by the thought that one would not be there to look after them. Later selves, however, evade all these thoughts by having the strange property that while they come into existence only with the death of their ancestor, the physical death of their ancestor will abort them entirely. The analogy seems unhelpfully strained when we are forced to the conclusion that the failure of all my projects and my consequent suicide would take with me all of my quote-unquote descendants, although they are, in any case, a kind of descendants who would arise only with my ceasing to exist. More than unhelpfully, it runs together what are two quite different questions. Whether my projects having failed, I should cease to exist, and whether I shall have descendants whose projects may be quite different from mine are, in any case, largely unknown. The analogy makes every question of the first kind involve a question of the second kind, and thus obscures the peculiar significance of the first question to the theory of the self. If, on the other hand, a man's future is not another self but the future of his self, then it is unproblematic why it should be eliminated with the future of that which might propel him into it. The primacy of one's ordinary self is given once more by the thought that it is precisely what will not be in the world if one commits suicide. If only we had another 15 minutes. If you'd like to read the paragraphs yourself, head on over to alifeofthought.com/D15. Or if you would like to join the conversation, head on over to community.alifeofthought.com. Remember, what I say here today is not the last word, it's the first one. So I look forward to hearing everything that you have to say. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.